Artificial Intelligence, a Fan's Novel. Book 1, Chapter 6, Fairy Tales. Monica had quickly put a stop to the secret new language that Martin had been teaching David. She'd overheard her mecha boy sharing some of the new, colorful words with Teddy. She appreciated that Teddy had suggested David keep these words to himself, but a boy was a boy, flesh or fiber, and Monica had disciplined him soundly. She had known immediately where the language had come from and sought Martin out. He hadn't taken his scolding quite as humbly as David had, but then she had scolded him a bit more sternly. In the back of her mind, she was glad that he was getting back to his prankish self. This was normal for little boys to do, wasn't it? And after all, David was pretty naive. Maybe Martin's playful pranks and teasing would help sophisticate him a little bit. David would have to get more into the swing of living with the newly reunited Swinton family. He was part of it now. Who knows, she thought. Maybe when Martin got better, David would be able to go places with him and his friends. Maybe to a movie or the Holocades or the zero-G chambers that were becoming so popular. In time, maybe David could learn to be one of the guys. But the impracticality of this thought became immediately apparent as images of her little mecha boy coming home painted up like a clown, or maybe pantless and dirty from some cruel boyhood initiation, flashed across her mind's eye. Or what if they broke him? Monica drove that thought from her head. She had been driving a lot of thoughts out of her head recently. Thoughts about David's future, about the effect the robot's continual attempts to please her might have on Martin. She'd been ignoring things too, like the fact that her little boys did not really get along that well. She ignored the little ways Martin tried to get David into trouble. She didn't see the way Martin scoffed at David's programmed innocence and childish manner. She hadn't recognized the impact it had on David when Martin laughed at him for calling her mommy instead of mom, insisting that the former was for little kids. David had stubbornly refused to use the shorter word, and Martin would not leave him alone about it until she finally intervened. She had not noticed the flat face that David donned every time Martin was near. The pinched eyebrows that had once signified his curiosity now displayed something new in David, something troubled. The mecha's vocal register was always happy when she was around, so she never really heard the flat way he responded to Martin when she wasn't near, the way he increasingly challenged Martin's implied authority over him. David refused to be a toy. He was a boy. But he was still expected to help Mommy take care of Martin, and he did so dutifully, even though the Orga boy was often stubborn. There were so many things to do. Martin had to eat and drink a lot of different medicines. There were drinks of all different colors, and little pills, and bigger ones that Martin had to take at different times of the day. He ate a lot too, a lot more than Mommy or Henry did. He was always chewing on something. Sometimes he spoke to David when there was something in his mouth. David had a hard time understanding what Martin said when he did this. He wanted to walk away from Martin at those times, but he was sure that this would displease Mommy. She said they should be friends, that they were actually brothers. Then, one afternoon, when Mommy was showing David some new medicine for Martin, the boy came into the room. He had something hidden behind his back. "Read to us?" Martin said. Monica realized how long it had been since she'd last read a story to her little boy. She'd love to. "What do you have there?" she said, reaching for the book. Martin handed it to her and then smiled strangely at David. David did not know what "read to us" meant, but Martin had made that face he always made when he did not want Mommy to know he was doing bad things. Monica didn't notice this expression because she was reading the cover of the book. She smiled at first, realizing that it was one of her favorites too. Then her expression slowly changed. She looked at Martin cautiously, and then at David. David read the cover. It said, Pinocchio by Carlo Collodi. "David's going to love it," Martin said. Monica ignored the hint of sarcasm in his voice. As soon as the show was over, the showman went into the kitchen where the lamb, which he was preparing for supper, was slowly turning on a spit in the furnace. Monica was reading to her two boys. They had taken out the boat and were now floating on the still waters of the pond as she read. The boys sat on either side of her, absorbed in the tale. David was entranced by the story. It made pictures in his head, and his brain had to do new things to create the images the words described. But as Mommy read, he saw that Martin had leaned close to her and began to stroke his fingers along her arm. David had watched this for a moment. The empty feeling was coming into his head again. He leaned close to her and duplicated the gesture. He immediately felt better. He began to follow the story again. Something in the words was moving him. His mind made some undefined sense of Pinocchio. When he saw that there was not enough wood to finish roasting it, he called the harlequin and the puncinello and said, "Bring me in Pinocchio. You will find him hanging on a nail. He is made of nice dry wood, and I am sure he will make a nice fire for my roast." How would Pinocchio get away? David wondered. Why didn't Pinocchio's father come to find him? Did he love him? David leaned closer to Mommy. Did she love him? Would she come to look for him if he got lost, taken away from her somehow? Cybertronics could not have imagined what a simple fairy tale was doing to their creation's mind. As the day dwindled on, they left the pond and walked slowly back to the house. Martin's legs were getting better, and he didn't need the braces anymore, but he moved slowly and had to rest sometimes. That night, as Martin lay in the canopy of his bed, Mommy pulled the book out and continued the story. David became entranced again as he sat in his sleeping place on the floor, watching Mommy lay beside Martin with the book. They were bathed in the soft blue nightlight of the bed. He didn't like the feeling of being so far away from her, especially when Martin was so close, but she had hugged and kissed him before she went to Martin's side, and that would last him the night. Pinocchio worked until midnight, and instead of making 8 baskets, he made 16, Mommy read. Suddenly, David understood Pinocchio. He worked hard. He worked hard because he wanted love. If Pinocchio worked hard and was obedient, his father would love him. This new connection locked into place, and David's mind gave him something like a thrill. It was the exhilaration of recognition. A missing puzzle piece had been set into place. David pondered this connection. What was fairy tale? It was a story, right? David knew story. A story told what happened, and things that happened were real, because unreal things don't happen. So a fairy tale must speak of real things. Then he went to bed and fell asleep. He dreamt he saw the fairy, lovely and smiling, who gave him a kiss, saying, "Brave Pinocchio, in return for your good heart, I forgive you all your past misdeeds. Be good in the future, and you will be happy." Then the dream ended. David was lost in the words. What was the dream? Was the blue fairy in a dream? David had never known anticipation. No mecha had ever felt the thrill that this special creation was feeling at this moment. And Pinocchio woke, full of amazement. You can imagine how astonished he was when he saw that he was no longer a puppet. Could this really be? But a real boy, just like other boys. Mommy read on, but David heard no more of the story. If he'd had a heart, it would have been racing as quickly as the streams of data coursing through his unique processor. His brain was alive with this new thing, imagination. A real boy, it said. Imagination had claimed a part of his brain, and there it would nurture itself and grow. A real boy, it repeated over and over. Were he even flesh and blood, he would not have closed his eyes that long night. Tensions between the Orga and Mecha siblings had been building all day. Martin had taken to sneering at David as he considered ways of putting the toy back in its place. He was annoyed by David's new fascination with the story from the day before. He'd thought the Pinocchio tale would have taken the mecha down a peg or two, but the thing was apparently too dumb to get the joke. All day long it had been asking Mom questions about fairy tales, where they came from, what they mean, what were dreams, and on and on. Martin didn't see how Mom could put up with all that, but at least the stupid thing would shut up once he came into the room. Mom had tried to tell him they were like brothers. Ha! As if Martin would have a fiber head for a brother. Things came to a head at the dinner table that night, when Martin noticed that the thing had been doing the fake eating again. He'd watched the robot pull this stupid routine every night since he had been well enough to sit at the table, and he was finally getting tired of it. Mom and Dad had been talking grown-up talk about some lady at Dad's job, and the robot was pretending to eat with them. Why couldn't it be like Teddy? At least Teddy knew it was a toy and didn't try to act real. Martin watched scornfully as David put the spoon to its mouth, pretended to chew, picked up a glass, pretended to drink. It even faked swallowing. What was it going to do next? Pretend to pee? When the mecha finally realized he was watching, it stopped and fixed him with a cold stare. David had been listening to Mommy and Henry talk while he ate. Another part of his brain was processing what Mommy had told him about dreams. Then he'd seen the look on Martin's face. He didn't like it when Martin looked at him that way. He stopped eating and stared back. When Martin made the mean smile, David knew something was about to happen. Martin suddenly knew how to get across the point he'd been trying to make with the Pinocchio story. He took a spoonful of spinach into his mouth while the dumb mecha stared. Then he opened his mouth so that the machine could see the food on his tongue. It was working. The mecha was watching his every move. Martin made a big show of chewing and swallowing. Then he opened his mouth so the dumb thing could see that the food was gone. There, that's what eating is, his eyes said. Try that, mecha. He sneered and went back to his meal. From his seat between them, Teddy had been watching the quiet confrontation brewing between his two charges. Mommy and Daddy were too busy talking to be interrupted, and he didn't have the words in his head for these things. He'd been programmed to recognize certain human interactions, especially childish ones, so he knew something was happening, but could not define it. He would do his best to not let things get out of control. David stared at the spinach bowl. Is that what made you real? Was that all it was? What made Martin so special? What was so special about eating? He glared at Martin, and a cold place opened in his brain. Then, in a gesture that unofficially marked a new epoch for mecha, an almost unnoticed movement, David reached for the spinach bowl. Teddy saw David's arm move across the table. The bear intercepted it quickly, penning it against the table's surface. "You will break," he warned. But David yanked the bowl away and shoved a spoonful of spinach into his mouth. He began to mimic Martin's tease, opening his mouth, displaying unmasticated food. He chewed madly then and shoveled more of the food into his mouth. David couldn't swallow. He had no need to, so the spinach he shoved into his mouth was being crammed down his useless throat as he shoved more in. and his chewing was causing it to stream into the tiny pressure release openings in his inner chest, where sensitive equipment regulated his vital functions. Martin had joined in the fun now, filling his own mouth full of the food he usually tried to ignore. Maybe the stupid thing would break. Henry stopped mid-sentence. Monica saw his expression and followed his gaze. To her shock, David's mouth was overflowing with spinach, and the mecha boy was stuffing more in. "Does he eat?" Henry said urgently, knowing the answer. I don't think so. He's not supposed to," Monica replied. "Should I get the book?" Henry said. What the hell kind of malfunction was this? "David, what are you doing?" Monica called out to him. But for the first time she could remember, the boy ignored her. "David, stop it," she commanded. When he actually ignored a direct command, she knew something was wrong. According to the manual, David should always obey a direct order, especially one from the imprinter. None of them knew how useless the manual had become. David was going to show Martin that he could do real stuff too, that he wasn't a scaredy-puss or a wimp like Martin had called him so many times. Each overflowing mouthful pronounced his defiance. Each simulated swallow was a battle cry. "Stop it now, David," Henry commanded. What would happen if you broke? Cybertronics would not be happy. "David!" he yelled. Monica started in on Martin. He was instigating, she said. He should put the fork down now. But it was quite common for real boys to disobey, and Martin was having more fun than he'd had in a long time. Teddy did not understand David's actions. Did he not know that food was for people? The super toy consulted his inner log of toy malfunctions, but could find no reference for this. He watched curiously, helplessly. Enough! Henry couldn't afford to be responsible for a malfunctioning robot's behavior. He reached out angrily and grabbed the mecha's wrist, surprised at the strength of its resistance. It managed to shovel in another mouthful in spite of Henry's grasp. Then suddenly, it just stopped. Monica was leaning over the table to help Henry take away the spoon when David just stopped moving. "David?" Monica said, concerned. The robot boy stared back at her with troubled eyes. His face went slack, became expressionless. The air was suddenly filled with the scent of burnt garlic, and there was a soft, metallic whining sound that came from David, from inside of him. Quickly his face began to change. The family gasped as one. David could not move. Something was wrong. He had no apparatus with which to taste, but he could feel the food against the sensory receptors in the flesh of his mouth. Inside he felt hot. He was broken. Broken. Why hadn't he listened to Teddy's warning? What had he been thinking? He had no word for the compulsion that had driven his actions. Mecha were never compelled before this moment. He looked at Mommy for assistance. He wanted to run to her. She must be able to make it better somehow. But he could not move. As he watched her face, the colors became wrong and blurry. "Help!" his mind screamed in silence from a paralyzed body. "Mommy, I'm broken!" The family watched helplessly as their new mecha's face seemed to melt like wax on one side. His cheek drooped down, and the sagging metal eye socket displayed a glint of the silvery gray light metals that comprised his mechanical infrastructure. Even Martin, who had secretly hoped to cause the robot some pain, had not expected a result of this severity. Henry was certain the director would demote him. Monica watched in fascinated horror as David's face grotesquely malfunctioned. "Oh, my little robot boy," she thought. "What have you done to yourself? What have you done?" "Smell that garlic," one of the techs said, as he pried loose a motion regulator clip from David's chest. The transparent clip was almost weightless in his hand. The spinach it was coated in weighed more. The state-of-the-art device contained more data than had once been contained in an entire mainframe. He carefully cleaned the spinach off the clip with a small sucking device, and then put the irreplaceable piece of David's anatomy in a cleaning solution until he was ready to put it back in. Monica was standing above David, who was laying on the table while the technicians operated. She held his upraised hand as she watched the operation with nervous anticipation. The men had arrived in record time after Henry had called. They had laid the frozen mecha on a hastily constructed work area. Then they quickly sliced into the small robot's chest cavity and clamped him open. He had been stiff as a rock when they arrived. Every piece of equipment that controlled his physical interactions with the world had been locked up in an automatic attempt to defend itself against the moisture from the spinach. But the errant little robot was moving now. It was talking softly to the woman on which it had been imprinted. The tech was glad she was here. He had been told these experimental models could get strange if the imprinter wasn't around. He smiled up at the woman to make sure she was okay. She looked stunned by the process. He figured that these things must be pretty good simulators to make people feel so strongly about them. He knew how to fix them, but not entirely what they did or how. David was still, after all, an unofficial project, a secret. The other tech winced at the sight of the green goop that coated the Mecha Boy's insides. There was some expensive equipment in there, more than he made in a year anyway. What the hell had this thing been trying to do? Oh well, he shouldn't be surprised. He'd been around long enough to know that when these things went, they tended to really go overboard. He'd seen some weird stuff in his time, stuff that the research guys upstairs wouldn't believe. Mecha who had suddenly begun to speak everything backwards when their sequence parameters got messed up. Others who had begun crawling around on all fours or laughing maniacally when some dormant toy software, or maybe a virus, suddenly sprang to life inside their head. Many mecha came with generic software that was used in different models. Sometimes those programs had unnoticed attachments. There were plenty of safeguards and redundant overrides that were supposed to keep this kind of stuff from happening, but there was no surefire way to avoid a screw-up. One time, long before he'd been hired by Cybertronics, he was sent to retrieve a butler mecha that had begun jumping up and down frantically, flailing its arms, until it broke its leg joints and fell to the ground. Even on the ground it had rolled around uncontrollably. The owners had been too scared of its unpredictable behavior to try and stop it, and the damage it had done to itself was extensive and expensive. After a long examination, he'd found the culprit. A dormant program had been activated in its processor, a bird simulator that had never actually been made to work correctly. How had it got there? How did these type of things always happen? Too few people, too poorly trained, trying to do too much with too little time and resources. He'd had to put the thing down and replace it. But this was something new. Cybertronics was a good company to work for. Good money, great hours, and definitely great projects. The David was supposed to be top of the line. Most of its functions were still secret, even to him. But the prototype had just shoveled itself full of spinach, and that decision was apparently not due to some processing malfunction. What the hell was going on? Even a dumb toy knew that eating was for Orga only. But then again, the thing had been made to simulate a child. Maybe it was supposed to do stupid, unpredictable stuff. But dangerous stuff? "Hey, kid," the tech said, getting David's attention. David looked away from Mommy, down over his opened chest cavity, at the man who held up a part of his insides. "You made a real mess of yourself, kid," the man said, and held up a spinach-coated clip for David to see. "Spinach is for rabbits, people, and Popeye, not robo-boys," the man said. Martin was watching from across the room. Mom had really laid into him while they had waited for the technicians to arrive. Dad had tried to come to his rescue, but she was having none of it. She was pretty pissed off. But Martin didn't see how it was his fault. The robot was the one who had started eating. He was just trying to show it the difference between them. He had explained all this, thrusting his chin up in a manner that he had inherited from her. But Mom had scolded him for not obeying her command to stop. Now it was his fault because he had supposedly instigated David. Damned Mecca. Henry had sighed in relief when the project support team had arrived. They'd taken a look at the robot and told him to not worry. Apparently this wasn't a major issue. He would have rather had the guys take the cursed thing with them, but Monica wouldn't hear of it, and of course it would have to be destroyed. He'd assured the director that he'd take good care of it, so as long as the thing wasn't totaled, it was theirs. Henry had wanted to avoid any questions from the main office and asked if it would be possible to keep this incident off the log. The lead man replied that his job was more important than Henry's embarrassment, but agreed to write it up as a mechanical malfunction. He really didn't know what else to call it anyway. Monica looked away from what was happening on the table. She wasn't comfortable watching the man operate. David wasn't flesh and blood, she knew that, but he was still her little boy, and seeing his insides, even though they were antiseptic optic clips and fibrous metal alloy, still wasn't easy. She hadn't wanted to watch at all, but one of the techs requested her presence. He wanted her to hold David's hand. If the imprinter wasn't there when David became unlocked, he said, the mecha might behave unpredictably. So she was the imprinter. Was that her title? She had reluctantly held David's frozen hand, and indeed when the malfunction that had locked him up was corrected, David had sprung into motion, desperately pawing the air with his arms and kicking his legs as if he were running from something. He had been repeating an urgent plea over and over. "Help me, broke! Help me, broke!" And Monica had reassured him, squeezing his too real hand to calm him. The mecha had looked up and focused on her. Then he'd smiled and relaxed. She had too. David had been horrified during the time when he couldn't move. He couldn't see anything except muddy blurs. But that was over now, and Mommy was here with him. He looked down and saw himself cut open. He felt strange sensations inside him as the men pulled machinery from his body and then clicked it back into place. Things seemed to be going on and off inside his legs and arms. He looked up and saw Mommy's face, creased in concern and worry. This made him feel good somehow. She was worried. That meant she loved him, didn't it? He would calm her. "It's okay, Mommy. It doesn't hurt," he said. Monica looked away from the mecha. His face was so innocent, so vulnerable. He didn't know what he was doing to her heart. How could she deal with this? She didn't want any more loss. She let go of David's hand and fled to the back of the room. One of the techs looked up as she rushed away. "Well, we lost our imprinter," he sighed. He looked down at David's face. "Now you just lay still and behave yourself," he ordered. Henry followed Monica to the dark corner of her retreat. He knew what an impact the mecha had had on her, but she shouldn't let this thing control her life now. They had their real son back. "Monica," he started hesitantly, "maybe it would be better if we let them take it," was how he was going to finish that statement. But she silenced him with an impatient wave of her hand. She couldn't bear more loss. Her heart had had enough. But David was so vulnerable. Why hadn't they made him more like other boys, more resilient, not so sensitive, so needy? She felt immediately guilty at this thought. David loved her purely, without reservation. Every small gesture of appreciation she gave him was his joy, every negligent slight his devastation. Was his love real? Or was it just the result of a mass of high-speed fiber and neural processors? Something told her, something deep inside beyond logic's restraints, that David's emotion was more than that David himself was somehow more than that. She walked around Henry and strode dutifully back to the table where the men worked on the little robot that had stolen her heart. She had made a commitment to David, just as he was committed to her. She would not abandon him. Once at the table, she took David's hand back into her own and smiled down on him. "I'm here, honey," she whispered. From where he stood, Martin could not hear his mother whisper these tender words to the Mecha, but he'd seen the way she held its hand. He'd seen the look on her face. What was going on here? Why all the special attention for a damned toy? What was all this talk about imprinting? His face grew grim as his mind began to work. Why had that robot really been brought here? The possibilities were dark paths down which he feared to tread, but there was only one thing that was important for now. This was his mom, and he was her son. The only one. "If you do something really, really special for me," Martin whispered conspiratorially in the dark bedroom, "let's call it a special mission. Then I'll go tell Mommy that I love you, and then she'll love you too." He'd gotten an idea from the movie they'd watched after the men who had fixed David left. Martin had been further infuriated by the way the Mecha had snuggled up to Mom on the couch as they'd watched. He'd seen this behavior before, but had thought nothing of it at the time. He thought it was only a program. Even Teddy used to do that. But now, after the scene in the kitchen, those memories had a new, darker meaning. David looked up from the game he'd been playing. His face was working normally now, and he could see everything just like before. He was happy about the way Martin was acting now, even though he was hesitant to trust the boy completely. But Martin had let him play with his copter simulator game, something he'd never done before. He'd even put his arm around David's shoulders as they walked upstairs when Mommy said it had been time to sleep. After the men from Cybertronics left, Mommy had scolded them both for acting badly and made a speech to them about being good to each other. She had said that David was now Martin's little brother, and Martin should look out for him, and he for Martin. Now Martin was suggesting something that might help him win Mommy's love. He came down from the bed and sat on the floor across from his big brother. "What shall I do?" he said cautiously. "You'll have to promise, and then I'll tell you," Martin said. David's brain analyzed this proposal. A promise was a serious issue, not to be taken lightly. David offered a different proposal. "You have to tell me, and then I'll promise," he said. Teddy was in the corner of the room, quietly sewing closed another small tear in the fabric of his old body. After Mommy's speech, the boys had seemed to get along, and Martin had been very quiet while they watched television. But Teddy listened carefully as he worked on himself, sensing something was going on. The Mecha wasn't too good at this, Martin realized. "I want a lock of Mommy's hair," he said. "I'll share it with you. If you had it and wore it, she might love you even more, like the princess in the movie. When she had the princess hair in her necklace thing, he loved her. Remember?" Of course David remembered. He never forgot anything. But this was not right. This was like sneaking. Sneaking was wrong. How come Martin always insisted on doing wrong things? "We can ask her," he suggested. No, it has to be a secret mission," Martin countered quickly, and then whispered the details of David's mission. "You must sneak into Mommy's bedroom in the middle of the night and chop it off." Teddy looked up when he heard this. What was Martin up to now? Was he playing bad games again? Alarms went off in David's head. This was more than just wrong. This was very bad. It went against everything that had ever been put into his brain. He was simply not supposed to sneak around taking things without permission, especially Mommy's hair. "I'm not allowed, Martin," he said. "You promised," Martin said, smiling that particular smile. He leaned close, his eyes sharpening. "You said tell me, and then I'll promise. Didn't you?" David was trapped. Was this a game? Had he made a promise? He analyzed all the statements between he and Martin. The alarms were still going off in his head, but his logic processors could find no way out. He'd made a promise, a bad one. Mommy's room was dark. David had never been here this deep into the night. He walked slowly, navigating the room carefully. The scissors that Martin had given him were held in his hand. He was not uncomfortable with this stealth. Slow, cautious movements had never been a problem for him. Martin had told him what side of the bed Mommy usually slept on, though David didn't really need that information. His vision was heightened in the dark. It was a survival feature that was pretty standard with all mecha. He made his way slowly to her bedside, alarms still ringing in his brain. When he found her, he stood quietly by the bed for a time. He could hear Henry's rumbling breath on the other side. Mommy was sleeping. She was so still. What was this sleeping? Why did real people have to do it? David knelt beside the bed. His head was full of contradictory feelings. In the secret place in his brain, where her face was a continual source of light and warmth, something in him cried out. This was wrong, and he knew it. He'd been tricked into making a promise, but inside he knew that he didn't have to obey Martin. He was here because he wanted Mommy's lock of hair, because he wanted her to love him more than she did Martin or Henry, because he did not want to share her with anyone else. Teddy had warned him. Teddy had told him that it was against the rules and that their job was to obey the rules. But what did Teddy know? He was just a toy, a dumb little toy from a box in the closet. David leaned over the bed. The calm in his face and movements were typical of his mecha nature, but inside his thoughts were chaos. Mommy was facing him, so he had to lean across her to get to her hair, which was spilled out across the pillow behind her head. He placed his knee on the bed and reached for the prize. Then he pulled back quickly as Mommy made a sudden movement in her sleep. Almost. He had almost woken her. If he'd had a heart, it would have been pounding in his chest. If he'd had breath, it would have been caught in his throat. For that one moment, his brain functioned clearly, and he saw how stupid and dangerous this secret mission was. But she was still again, and with great excitement, David saw that she had turned her head slightly, so that her hair was dangling over the edge of the bed. The rational part of his brain, the one Cybertronics had built, was forced once again into the back seat, as this new part of his mind took control once more. This part of him that had been growing slowly ever since Mommy had brought him to life. David moved cautiously, placing the scissors over the dangling strands of Mommy's hair. It was smooth and glistened in the night. If what Martin had said was real, then all he had to do was keep her hair by his heart, and she would love him. All he had to do was grab a lock of her hair and... In her fleeting dream, David had been yelling her name, calling out to her from across some great invisible expanse. But Martin had been at her side, looking at her accusingly. He'd spoken no words, but his face had made plain his thoughts. You tried to replace me with a toy, didn't you? Didn't you? The dream had woken her with a sudden jolt, and she turned and felt something against the bed. She opened her eyes to see something thin and shiny reflected in the faint light from the windows of the room. It pressed against her eye, and she cried out. David closed the scissors. Henry opened his eyes when he heard his wife yell. He saw the mecha leaning over the bed, silhouetted against the white walls behind them. Was that a knife? Then he heard the metallic snick and realized what had happened. "David, what are you doing?" he roared, jumping over his wife and grabbing the thing by the shoulders. "What the hell were you doing, David?" he repeated, shaking the thing violently. "Why, David? Why did you do that? God damn it, answer me!" David recoiled in fear and dropped the scissors. Henry shook him violently and yelled some of the bad words that Martin had tried to teach him. With his night vision, he could see clearly the anger in Henry's face, and there was a lot of it. Henry was very angry. Monica rose and grabbed her husband's arm. "Henry, you're hurting him!" she yelled. Henry was shaking the boy violently. His little mecha head was rolling back and forth on his neck. How could he expect him to answer? "Henry, you're hurting him!" she cried again. But Henry didn't hear her. "Damn it, David, don't pull that silent routine on me again. Why? Why?" He'd had enough of this damn machine. First the spinach trick, and now this. "Why?" he yelled. Monica grabbed Henry's arm, frightened by his escalating violence. "You'll break him!" she yelled. Henry stopped shaking the mecha. She was right. He couldn't afford to replace it, could he? He released it, and it collapsed to the floor, shielding itself in simulated fright. Before, Henry had been chastened by the mecha's innocent pose, but now, as the pathetic thing cowered before him, he felt a touch of satisfaction. David's eyes were wide with fright and surprise. His mouth was open with an utterance that never came. Henry's violence had been unprecedented in his life. He had nowhere in his brain to flee from such a thing. He cowered as the man glared at him in the dark. He hadn't been disobeying Henry's commands to answer. He'd simply not known the answer. Why had he broken the most basic rule to any of his kind and endangered Norga? There was only one reason. "Henry?" David said weakly, frazzled by the manhandling. "I wanted Mommy to love me more." Henry didn't say anything. His eyes were angry, and there was something else there now, something that David had not seen before, not even in Martin's ambiguous smiles. Monica moaned. "Oh my God," she said, cupping her face. Henry turned to her. "What's wrong, honey?" he said urgently. "My eye, I think it's bleeding, Henry," she cried. They rose from the bed and rushed into the bathroom, where David heard them knocking things around in a frantic search of the cabinets. Mommy's frantic cries pounded against his brain. What had he done? He had been wrong. He had done a very bad thing. Mommy would never love him now. He had hurt her. In his fear and self-recrimination, he did not see the lock of hair that fell to the floor from the edge of the bed, where it had been cut from Mommy's mane. It slipped over the folds of the blanket and wafted to the floor, descending slowly, alighting silently on the carpet, perhaps to be forgotten and discarded forever. Teddy watched the hair fall. He'd been standing quietly in the hallway while David was on his secret mission. He had come into the room after the commotion broke out to see David sitting silently, staring into the darkness while Mommy and Daddy talked excitedly in the bathroom. Teddy regarded the fallen hair. Symbols were far beyond his level of processing, but he knew that something had changed, something important, and the hair seemed to encapsulate the meaning of this change. He stood over the curled strands, in his own way pondering their significance. What now? Sitting in the darkness of his room, Martin had heard Mom scream and then Dad cursing at David. At first he'd laughed. "Gotcha, you stupid fiberhead," he'd whispered to himself. The taste of revenge had been sweet, but short-lived. He'd heard David's pathetic whine about wanting Mommy to love him, and that should have made him feel even better. It should have made his night. He should have reveled in his triumph. But it hadn't, and he didn't. He'd heard Mom's agonized moans and Dad's urgent questions. Their footfalls were heavy as they raced into the bathroom. That damn robot better not say anything. That had been his immediate thought. Then he realized that he had had a part in this, that he might have caused his mom to get hurt. Some new feeling tugged at his conscience. It was the first struggling effort of a growing boy to break away from the selfishness of childhood. But Martin didn't know that. He just knew that he felt bad. If something bad happened to his mom, he'd never forgive himself. Why had he sent David to do this thing? What had he done?